And I suspect that when we make lists of those we have harmed, where do you think we put ourselves on that list?
I would tend to say, well, I haven't harmed anyone. If anything, a lot of harm was done to me.
I can forgive almost anybody for almost anything, but I have trouble forgiving myself for even little things.
If I make amends to him, how do I do that for 6 years ago or 4 years ago for not having been there then?
If I say I'm sorry today and I go right back to my old behavior tomorrow, have I really made amends?
This program is the 8th in a series of 12 candid conversations between George Mann and Dick Rice. They've walked the 12 steps of AA, gained new insights, and deepened their spirituality in the process. In this program, they'll share some of their personal stories and growth experiences with you. Dr. George Mann is Medical Director of St. Mary's Chemical Dependency Services in Minneapolis. Father Dick Rice is the Director of Loyola Spiritual Direction Center in St. Paul, Minnesota.
It's quite remarkable to me, George, how many of the 12 steps are to be found in the Sermon on the Mount. I'd like to anticipate the 8th step with this from the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel. As I said, the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus is speaking. If you bring your gift to the altar and there recall that your brother or sister has anything against you, leave your gift at the altar. Go first to be reconciled with them, and only then come and offer your gift.
As Jesus spoke and was very specific in his directions, so this step, the 8th step, is very specific. It says, we made a list of all the persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Going back again to the concept of shalom, the concept of peace, the concept of harmony. Conflict, disharmony blocks spiritual growth. And as we're processing through the steps all the way up to the 8th and 9th now, again, this principle is held up before us to take a look at. It's held up so clearly in that passage, and that if I want to grow, if I want to become a better person, one of the major impediments to that is my unwillingness, my inability, my blindness to see where I've injured others and to make amends to those that I've injured.
I certainly agree. And to make sure that we stay with the step, I'd like to tease out with you again, like we did with the last step, the words that we want to be particularly attentive to in the step. Made a list, the persons we had harmed, and resolved to make amends.
I think the first of those words that is critically important in this step gets right down to very clear, specific directions. If there's anything in the 12 steps that smacks of cookbook therapy, it's the 8th step, because they say, make a list. Now, if you're looking through the 12 steps, when a step says make a list, that's a lot different than I turned my life over to the care of God. I became aware, all those large concepts. Here is something that's very specific. It says, sit down and make a list. I think that the wisdom of list making is something that's very important. If I would ask you right now, if you would name all the birds that you know, I don't know how many you would name. You might name 10 birds. But if I gave you a pencil and paper and said, now sit down and make a list of all the birds that you know, and I'd give you the time to do that, you would probably come up ultimately with a list of 10 times the list that you could give me by just sort of off the top of your head talking about what you know.
But I'll tell you, I would more prefer to say, well, I guess I could name 75 than to even try to begin to name them. And to do that list, ooh, I would want to resist that, which shows again the wisdom of the cookbook, that until we put it down on paper, we haven't really acknowledged it.
There is a process of thinking that seems to come into play very specifically when we begin to make lists of anything. It forces us to categorize things. It forces us to look deeply into things. And I suspect that when we make lists of those we have harmed, where do you think we put ourselves on that list?
Well, it certainly forces me to prioritize, and I probably wouldn't even put myself on that list until I had really reflected. Even deeper than that, it does force me to acknowledge that there are people that I have harmed. I want to avoid that, just that time and space commitment to drawing up the list. Now, where would I put myself? Well, I guess I have to start back a little bit now. I'd be speaking as a member of Al-Anon, and I found I've really resisted this step. I would tend to say, well, I haven't harmed anyone. If anything, a lot of harm was done to me by chemically dependent people that my life was enmeshed with in one form or another. So I would resist listing anyone, and certainly would resist most of all listing myself. But I'm to be found there on that list. And there are more people on that list than I would have liked to have acknowledged before I started carving out their names.
I think as we talk about destructive behaviors, harmful actions, patterns of behavior that lead people to where they don't want to go, and you look at the person who gets harmed by that, the person who gets harmed the most is the person themselves. The person who is hardest to forgive is the person themselves. I can forgive almost anybody for almost anything, but I have trouble forgiving myself for even little things. When it comes to making amends, how do we begin to get ready? Which is all this step says. We begin to get ready to make amends to those we have harmed.
Well, I'll move to that with you, and how we make amends to ourselves if we find ourselves on that list, if we certainly do. I'd like to stay with the making of the list, and how does one even uncover who might be candidates for that list? I find in my Al-Anon reading, the One Day at a Time in Al-Anon, that only once, again, specifically in the course of a year's reading of Thoughts for Every Day, only once is the 8th step specifically spoken of. But it's very poignant when it is spoken of as to who might be candidates for that list and how to uncover who they are. Today's reminder: whom have I injured? Surely those closest to me, my family. I know that my hostile reaction to the alcoholic has been hurtful. Have I also damaged my children by subtly indoctrinating them with contempt for their alcoholic parent? Have I communicated my anxiety and resentment to them? Have I taken out my frustrations on them? And all of a sudden, the list begins with those who are closest to me as very probable, for me in Al-Anon, candidates for that list.
And I think the other thing that pointed out is that that list incorporates, or as you begin to look at the list, it's not only those who have been harmed directly, it's those who have been harmed indirectly by my anxiety, my depression, my resentments. The list, as you indicate, the list certainly gets larger and larger. And then the other thing, too, is that Do we include things in things that we have injured? Organizations, the company we work for, the organization we represent, our country, our church, all those, you know, and making amends to a person, finding a legitimate, productive way to do that is difficult.
The earth itself, the animals in our household, the plants in our household, the things that we've been privileged enough to have, we've probably neglected them as well. I find if I ask myself the questions coming from that step, is there anyone I am not speaking with? Is there anyone I'm harboring a grudge against? Anyone I'm nursing a hurt? Anyone I'm holding out a resentment toward? That I find my list gets pretty full pretty fast when I really come to work this step.
And you know, the other piece to that is to say, how do we harm people? You just mentioned several ways of how we can harm people. By coming out of resentments and bearing grudges, by ignoring them, by gossiping about them, by tearing down their reputations, by avoiding them, by withholding ourselves from them in any way that where we ought to be legitimately with them. Both the direct and the indirect. If you begin to look at all those things, you say that list can get very long and very inclusive.
But as you speak, I want to resist that so much. I don't know if it's as true for the alcoholic, but for myself in Al-Anon, I find my self-righteousness gets stirred up very quickly. Any of those things that I have done, any speaking against, any gossip, any slander, it's always been to get a little bit even with the alcoholic or the workaholic. I can justify all of that harm that I have done, either actively or by neglect, very easily on the basis of justifying myself, getting what I had coming to me.
And the small word in the step that addresses that is the word all. All the people. See, I can maybe make amends to so-and-so and so-and-so and so-and-so, but that person who did that thing to me that was so harmful, so painful, how can I ever forgive them? How can I ever make amends to that person who has done this horrendous thing to me? So I'll come up with my list of 50 people, and that person is on the list, but I'm going to put a small X to that person's name and say, that person is still going to stay on that list. That organization that did those things to me, that took these things away from me, I'll never forgive them.
But at least I've got them on the list, and so I'm beginning to work with them. Now, if you found yourself on the list, if you were a good, healthy workaholic or alcoholic, what would it look like to have done harm to yourself that would even indicate that you're a candidate for the list? You know, that I have harmed myself in the course of these years of overeating or overworking.
I think there are probably 4 guidelines that we can use. Has that behavior injured my mental or physical health, whatever it is? Has it been destructive in my relationships with my family? Has it been destructive in my relationships with other people, my social life? And has it been destructive in my job, in my occupation? Now, whether it's work, alcohol, money, drugs, sex, whatever the issue may be, if I reflect the behavior against those 4 areas of my life, that's how I can tell. That's the yardstick that I can use to say, how has injury occurred?
Well, using that yardstick, what would amends then begin to look like?
I think here, again, we're talking about a word, and I think we have to be clear what that word means, you know, to make amends. I think as we get into the ninth step talks about direct amends. This step doesn't talk about direct amends. This talks about amends, and there's an implication of the two steps that it's direct and indirect. I think one of the things about making amends is that, again, as we've talked through the steps, we keep saying this is a process that we go through. Making amends is also a process that we go through. It isn't a specific thing. There are some things. If I have injured you, I can say, Dick, I did this to you, and I'm sorry. I can make a direct amend that way. But what do I do from there on in? If I say I'm sorry today, and I go right back to my old behavior tomorrow, have I really made amends? You would certainly be very justified and say, well, George, you have treated me shabbily for a long time. I'll accept this beginning of the amends that you're making, but I'm not really convinced that you've really changed. I'm going to be watching you. Now, you may say that consciously, subconsciously, subliminally, but that amend process is how I treat you from here on in.
So it's not a matter of making up for lost time.
Oh, no.
Because one of the resistances I find with people to even being willing to enter into the eighth step is they're overwhelmed almost by a tidal wave of saying, it's been 8 years that I've been harboring this grudge against him. 8 years that I've been carrying this resentment. Now, if I make amends to him, how do I do that for 6 years ago or 4 years ago for not having been there then? So it's not a matter of making up for lost time.
Absolutely. And I think here, again, we're talking about becoming willing to do it. I mean, that's a key word in there, because I think one of the major problems that I've seen with people around this step is they say, how do I make amends to my father who is now dead? How do we make amends to the dead? During all those years when he was alive, I was doing all these things, or my mother, or whoever the person may be, and now that person is dead, and what do I do? I think that's why the step talks about being willing, the process of becoming willing to see that amends are in order, that I owe some amends, that the person has been harmed. I may not be able to make them. The conditions are such that it may be making that amends making may be impossible, but I can take an attitude. I can take the attitude of amends making with no matter who. I can begin to give up some of that baggage, some of the anger, some of the resentment, some of the hurt, some of the issues that I've carried for a long time. And indirectly, I can begin to make amends internally, and that's where it all begins.
That's where it begins. Now, it's almost parenthetical and has to do more with the next step, but I find that if I'm dealing with someone who has the deceased parent, perhaps, to make amends to, I find that they have faith at all to believe that that parent is on her way to God, is living beyond death, then there still is amends to be made to such a one, even now. And God knows the deceased might really depend on that forgiveness being given or asked for. I
think becoming willing, again, is such a key word, because it for the person who is processing toward spiritual growth, it reflects an internal change. We briefly spoke of humility. And we talked about having our feet firmly planted in the earth, accepting a reality. Part of accepting a reality is to know that I have harmed you, to know that I have damaged you in some way, and to know that I have a legitimate debt to you that needs to be somehow amended, and that my recovery is dependent upon my ability to be ready to process that.
There are a couple of other points where I find people balk at that willingness that I'd like to touch. One is the realization of how understandable it was, whatever I might have done. Someone coming into recovery might well say, how could I have neglected my children for these last 8 years? And just be overwhelmed at that they did it, now that the light of day is shining in their lives. Well, as they come to see, it's very understandable. They just did what people do when they're sick. They did what people tend to do when they're workaholics. They neglected the kids along the way. Doesn't make it right, but if people can see that it's understandable that they did what they did, if they can understand what their intent might have been to provide everything for the family and so get caught up way out here in their eating disorder or their work disorder, then I think they can be more willing to make amends if they can see what I did was understandable. Not right, but understandable. And also to see that while I might have been doing these crazy, sick things, God was still working good through that time. Our higher power was still working on behalf of my loved ones. I might have neglected them for a number of years, but that doesn't mean that God neglected them or life neglected them. It wasn't so heinous what I did that they were left totally bereft while I was crazy as I was or sick as I was for this period of time.
I think what that person has to recognize and has to know, that in this amends-making process, it's true that the person that you make amends to profits by the amends. They can put some things to rest. They can feel better about you and about your relationship. But the person who profits the most is you. The person who profits the most is the person who is making the amends, not the person who is receiving the amends. And I think that it's important for people to understand that making amends is a necessary ingredient along that path of growth and development that we keep talking about in this series. It's critical for me to try to establish the best relationships I can with the significant people in my life. If that entails amends making, it's critically important for me that I do that. And the longer I resist it, the more I impede my own growth. I think one of the other things that we talked about earlier in this program was, how do I make amends to myself? How do I do things? How do I change my life in ways that I am making amends to myself? The person who is recovering from alcoholism needs to look at the development of a good, healthy lifestyle, looking at their exercise, their weight, their smoking, their social life, of getting some balance into their lives, of having fun, of doing the kind of things that they need to do beyond giving up drinking, that returns them to a good, healthy life, a good, healthy person.
Did someone show you my own recovery program? That reads like my own recovery program.
Well, I'm not surprised, because I know that you have dealt with your own recovery program in a very holistic, total kind of way, and so it's not only doing the kind of things that are the obvious things. It's that kind of personal amends making of doing the things that we need to do to take care of ourselves. Whether we are members of Al-Anon or AA or NA or EA or whatever the A may represent, all those things, or whether we're not members of any organization, of a self-help organization. What we're talking about here is a program that looks at human beings as people who are on a journey and who are growing and who have the potential to grow, And this is a process whereby they can use these 12 steps toward that kind of growth. I don't think there's any adult, any person who has reached adulthood or adolescence for that matter, who can legitimately say, I have never harmed anyone. There was no one that in my life that I ever have done anything to that I need to make amends to. We've spoken a lot about pride. What keeps people from making amends is pride. The more pride I have, the more self-justification I have, the more I'm wrapped up in myself, the more it's me first, everybody else second, the more making amends to anyone is a foreign, unacceptable act that I go through.
You've walked so close to the next step that we're ready to take it, I think. It's just going to be a short hop to the next one. Thank you very much. This has been wonderful.